Next up in my Great Director series is a director from Turkey who has been working for the past 20 plus years. It's Nuri Bilge Ceylan. Now, if you take a look at Ceylan's Wikipedia page or other places where it discusses him personally or biographically, you see he's won a lot of film festival awards, a lot of acclaimed awards, the Palme d'Or for Winter Sleep in 2014, Cannes Film Festival. He's won many awards there. So what makes him great? Is it because he's won those awards? Well, maybe for some people, but for me, there are other things. And to me, he has inherited some of the classical Western tradition. He loves Russian artists, Chekhov in particular, whom he gave credit to for in his movie Winter Sleep for the screenplay. You can see Chekhov influences, especially Chekhov, the playwright, all throughout Ceylan's movies, and other Russians, Dostoevsky, as well as the great Russian film master Tarkovsky. I think, this is my opinion, he's taken the great masters of the mid to late 20th century, Tarkovsky, Bergman, maybe Kieslowski, definitely Ozu. Oh, there's a bunch of influences here, and he's developed them. He's sort of moved them into the 21st century, moved their style and aesthetic into the 21st century with his own films, and he's particularized their, what they've developed in their own day for Turkey. He's definitely making Turkish films that have some to a lot of universal appeal. I think people from around the world can watch his movies and get a lot out of them, but definitely they feel like they're Turkish movies all the way through. Just FYI, there's a Ceylan collection out there. This is a Blu-ray collection. I think it's plays on Region 2 DVD Blu-ray players. Not the greatest picture of him ever. I'll put a better picture up, but this is a really good collection that I really appreciated, and most of these discs are really crisp, and some of these movies are hard to find. Let's take a little bit of a look at Ceylan as an auteur. Whether you've seen his films or not, this won't matter. This will be a great introduction if you haven't. It will be helpful if you have. I believe Ceylan is an auteur because when you watch his movies, as I did chronologically, you can see a lot of stylistic patterns, a lot of story choices that are familiar. His later work is definitely riffing on his earlier work. Some of these works combine into sort of whole Ceylan worlds, as it were. And so here are some of the things I observed as I watched his movies chronologically. One thing he loves to talk about, and this is particularly Turkish, but it's also could be a universal theme, is the difference between urban and rural settings. The outsiders and the insiders, people coming from cities into small rural Turkish villages, or the opposite, people going from those rural villages into Turkish cities, such as Istanbul. In that rural-urban insider-outsider dynamic, I think plays a role in his own life as an artist, and I think some of his ideas, are that the camera, the artist, the director, is an invader when he or she goes into a particular place to film it, to make art out of it. They're warping and changing that world for their own particular vision and distorting it. I think he's well aware of that certain problem in art, particularly his own, when he himself, as a high artist, as it were, goes into rural Turkey with villagers who have no education, and he makes something out of their village and tries to speak for them, as it were. This dynamic then becomes, in some of his films, a very educated person contrasted with the wider world. That comes up in Winter Sleep, one of my favorites from him, where a very educated man holds himself off in a rural Turkish hotel or inn or Airbnb. A wonderful setting, but the difference between him and the villagers nearby, whom he doesn't interact with much and is very different from. That comes up in his movie Uzak, also called Distant, in which a rural villager who is a cousin of a man in a city, and he's a very well-educated man, comes to visit and stay with his cousin, and then you sort of have an odd couple relationship between them, a very well-educated Turkish man in a city versus this rural or less educated person who's come in from a rural village and is in a new environment. Along with that, he likes to talk about artists who are holed up in their own work, artists who don't fit into their environments and yet are dealing with them and writing about them. That comes up in probably half of his movies. His last movie, Wild Pear Tree, is about a budding young man who is an artist trying to write about rural Turkey, the region where he's from, but he has a strange relationship with it. He doesn't like it. He thinks these people are podunk. His father's a gambler and a teacher and has sort of wasted his life, he feels like, and he's going to write a book about it. But how do you create art about this kind of setting are you going to be condescending toward it or not? That comes up in a lot of his movies. Another thing he loves to play with is distance. Now, a lot of artists in film like to play with distance in terms of the widescreen, one side versus the other side, the far right side versus the left side, to show distance between characters, distance between people or places, and so on. But Ceylan goes back to that old 4:3 way of doing it, which is to have distance with foreground and background. And he loves to show, in his own movie called Distant, as I said, the difference between people in the foreground and the background. Oftentimes one is fuzzy or out of focus, which figuratively shows that the relationship is at a great distance from one another. This kind of shot comes up pretty much in all of his filmography over 20 years. Along with that distance and the inability to see a character in the distance of the foreground, showing relationship distance between characters, or his love of showing windows and people inside places looking outside, and the window is distorting the outside reality because it's opaque or it's hard to see out of for some reason. That happens in his first movie, happens in his last movie, most recent movie, and it definitely is the interesting opening shot of Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, a wildly acclaimed movie, and for good reason. The opening shot is that you, the viewer, not just a character, but you're a character in the drama, look inside a window, but you can't see in. Then he shows you inside, and then a character comes to the window and then goes outside. The question about the inability to see is, for him, I think, kind of a classic Western idea, the inability to perceive and then to not know truth or not know reality as it is. This is one of his favorite things to deal with. And then being an insider within a home or within a place versus not being outside in nature. This comes up throughout. And the yearning that these characters have, the end of Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, the great schoolhouse scene in his first movie, Kasaba. Over and over again, he likes this idea of people, typically men actually, looking outside windows, not being able to get outside, being able to see or perceive, or not being able to see or perceive. And then you get a lot of character development and character psychology from these kinds of shots. He absolutely loves wind, and wind is a dynamic. Now, a lot of his shots, except for a couple movies, are static and long take static shots. He's definitely working in some kind of slow cinema tradition. But the wind that blows through some of his scenes is very dynamic. It only happens a few times in each of his movies. But I think it's to show dynamism and change and give a little visual aesthetic excitement and interest. Actually, also sonic excitement and interest when the wind blows in these scenes, is in the movie, his most recent movie as of this video, Wild Pear Tree, in which the wind is the desire of the young man when he sees an old friend, an old high school female friend, then meets her alone, and that sort of the desire in the garden or desire of the leaves is a really interesting image in this film. Now, these shots always bring up something you must notice, I think is essential, that he loves seasons, and he picks for each movie certain seasons to highlight or to photograph. For his first movie, Kasaba, he actually does it in 4 seasons, so you see spring, summer, winter, fall. And then in his other movies like Winter Sleep, that's definitely set in winter. His latest movie, Wild Pear Tree, set in autumn. Uzak, Distance, set in winter. You'll have to notice which season it is in his movies, and then sort of get the feel, and that actually sets the feel and the tone for the movie, what he wants to say about the characters. The characters are always sort of influenced by the seasons or the season that they're in, and they don't quite know it. Now, I mentioned winter here. I think he is one of the greatest photographers, directors of winter ever. His shots, working with Gökhan Teryaki, forgive me for the pronunciation, but he is a fantastic cinematographer. I have no idea why Hollywood hasn't snapped him up and used him. Great directors in Hollywood. I would go after Gökhan if I were a director. I mean, he's worked with Ceylan a number of movies, the last 5 or 6 that Ceylan has made. They have created some absolutely amazing, not only scenes of rural Turkey or the environmental aspect of Turkey, but also just the winter scenes are absolutely stunning and beautiful. And it's just, if all you're going to do is watch Ceylan for the cinematography, that's fine. You will be awed. Now, I should go through his movies quickly, and I'm using the Blu-ray collection I showed you earlier. Kasaba is his first film. Do not miss this. This is a really interesting film experiment in which Ceylan, in his first feature, using low-quality equipment, actually does a lot of Tarkovsky-like stuff. And I was really awed by this movie. I found it quite provocative. It's not perfect, in my opinion, not completely hypnotic, but this is a great movie. And then his next movie, Clouds of May, he does a little Kiarostami thing here, which this is a movie about the making of his first movie, Kasaba. Something he likes to do, and I would say his first 3 movies plus his last movie are somewhat connected. I think they're autobiographical in part as well. They have, that connection of the young people going into a rural village, the artist trying to make sense of rural Turkey and trying to make something of it. That's what happens in these couple of first movies he made. Now, his third movie, Uzak, I've mentioned several times in this video, is one of my favorites. I think it's one of his 2 or 3 best, and if you were going to start with one, this is one of the 2 or 3 I would start with. Pretty simple tale overall, beautiful cinematography, super well done, and you will get all of this, or most of the stuff I mentioned in this video in this one movie, which is absolutely captivating. His first feature, as I said, also called Distant. His next couple movies, his 4th and 5th feature, are not my favorites. They're actually my least favorites, but you should look them up and see if you might like them. He actually stars with his wife in Climates. This is his one opportunity he gave himself to act in a movie. He wrote, directed, acted. I don't know if he produced in this. He might have, and then his wife is here on the cover. But a marital relationship that's breaking down. And very interesting consideration of females in his movies. There are actually not a lot of that. Most of his movies are about men. But in this particular movie, it features his wife and the grief and sadness over potential separation or definite separation, potential divorce in modern Turkey. And then his next movie, 3 Monkeys, is a noirish kind of movie. Now, it's a very slow burn movie. And this one, his 5th feature, is getting him into his next 3, in which he really develops his style, really changes quite a bit, and I think adds a lot to his repertoire. These next 3 movies I'm going to mention are outstanding. This movie is a super interesting movie. Once Upon a Time in Anatolia. It's not my favorite of his, as you might see on my Letterboxd reviews, but it's worth pursuing. A police procedural which does not go very fast. In fact, it focuses on the policemen who are oftentimes bored and waiting on things to happen, and on a suspect who can't remember anything for a long time in this movie. Most of this movie is them traveling around the countryside looking for a body. The movie ends with an autopsy, so it barely gets into the detective story and the police procedural. At 2.5 hours, this is a long, slow ordeal. But Chekhovian, I think that describes his film and work in some ways, not all the way, but this movie certainly is, focusing on a police detective, or maybe Dostoevsky too, a police detective and a doctor, and the shot making in this is absolutely outstanding, and the sonic effects, he's a master of sound. This is definitely a good one to try, but I wouldn't start with this, or I wouldn't recommend to most people that I know to start with this. I think actually, I started with it, and it almost turned me off on him, but I had to watch it again. Once I watched it again, it was better. So I would probably see this as my 3rd Ceylan movie. Now, I'm completely biased here with this movie. This movie feels like it's about me, an introvert, one who loves books, holed up in a wonderful, magical place in a winter setting, winter sleep, yet it's about a curmudgeon and a man who can't deal with his other people, including his own wife. I absolutely love the look of this movie, the story. All of the cutting is perfect in this movie. I think this is his masterpiece. I've had to pick one, but it is, I can see myself in it. So that's why I'm super biased. I strongly recommend that people try this movie. Now, his most recent movie as of this video, 2022, I'm making this in early 2022, is a movie I think pretty much everybody in the world could see and appreciate. Wild Pear Tree. It is super long, 3 hours. It's about a young man who's finished his college education. He goes back home, where he's from, to a sort of rural Turkish town, and he's the artist who wants to write about this place, but yeah, he feels disdain. He has some arrogance and condescension towards it, certainly towards his own father. And the movie highlights that father-son relationship very well. This movie is really a series of conversations. It's a movie where the kid goes to see his friends, his former high school female friend, his grandparents. He goes to meet a famous or a relatively well-known Turkish writer on Turkish villages. He goes to see other old friends, and you can see it's wonderfully acted by the main character here. This is wonderfully acted by the star of this movie. He shows this kid, 20, 25 years old, being different in different situations and struggling with, coming to terms with where he's from and his own father. And the guy he acts differently in every different situation. you would hope for growth and development in this character, and you'll see if that happens. I mean, the threat is he could turn into the guy that's in the previous Ceylan movie, Winter Sleep, or he could be something else. This is a wonderful sort of coming-of-age story. I know that's a very cliched label, but I think Ceylan does it so well that this movie is worth pursuing. Probably also my second recommendation, along with Uzak, and then Winter Sleep and Once Upon a Time Anatolia, if you're going to start with Ceylan. Now, what do you think about this video and what I said in it, and what else in Ceylan have you seen and noticed that I didn't say? Which of his movies would you recommend? Why would you recommend them? Please put that in the comments, and let's have a sort of helpful dialogue down there for people who are relatively new to Ceylan, or have watched one or two of his movies and thought, oh, those were way too slow, way too hard, I didn't like them. Let's develop the comments and see if we can sort of help people out understand this wonderful, to me, wonderful and great artist who I hope he keeps making movies. Thanks for watching this channel. Please subscribe for more great content. Have a great day.